Good evening. I'm very happy to be here at Beth El Synagogue. I also just learned that Steve Feinstein was a member of the synagogue, which makes this a very special occasion for me to be here, and I'm actually very proud and happy to give this lecture here. Thank you all for coming, and I very much look forward to a fruitful discussion after the talk. I would like to start with quoting Alain Finkel, who I'm sure many of you know, who's this French philosopher. He said in a conference in Jerusalem, a conference on Holocaust education in 2010, he said the following words: "We wanted to extinguish the flames of anti-Semitism with the water of memory. And it suddenly appears that we are adding with memory fuel to the fire. The more we commemorate, invoke, and teach the pain of the Holocaust, the more we infuriate countries, continents, communities, and minorities which don't feel accountable for these events. While commemoration," continues Finkel, "increases in other parts of the world, rage grows at the good fortune of the kings of misfortune, the Jews. That is the way it goes in numerous schools all over my country, in France. Youngsters show their disgust not at what was done in Auschwitz, but at the memory of Auschwitz." How is this possible? How has it come to this situation? I have used the term anti-Semitism in the title of this talk, and as we will see, and what we can already see at this cartoon from a Spanish mainstream newspaper, anti-Semitism is a proper term for these expressions. Still, as it happens very often, defining something as anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic can be an easy way out of the dilemma. It obscures the complexity of the phenomenon. And what I'd like to do today is address this issue, this connection between Holocaust, memory, and anti-Semitism, address this issue, and shed some light on a complex phenomenon that has several ramifications that are different sources across countries and groups, and that is also rooted in important misunderstandings of what the Holocaust actually is. I have structured my talk in the following way, just to give you a little bit a summary of what this will be about. You can still think if this is something for you, if not. So I would like to go over this different topics. I would like to define what is this issue of global memory, and let's see this process from Jewish to a global to universalized memory. Then what are the lessons of the Holocaust? What's the lessons of never again? And here we will discuss this tension between particularist and universalist interpretations of the Holocaust. The issue of racism and anti-Semitism, how is it understood and misunderstood? And the fact if we can speak about the Holocaust or if we should speak just about genocides. And that is something that I come across almost on a daily basis as the director of a center with the name of Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Many will ask, but why not just genocide studies? What is so particular about the Holocaust? The issue of memory envy, I hope we'll have time for all that. Rivel told me I have 3 hours in my talk. Memory envy, competitive victimhood, and then try to reach some conclusions. I would like to start with this image here, which is a poster from 1946, a poster from a Munich DP, a displaced persons camp. And the poster was produced and distributed by the Jewish Historical Commission. As many of you know, I'm sure Doris Einweber, who's just in front of me, you know well, this was a Jewish organization that was charged with preserving a record of the events, of the persecution of the Jews during the Nazi era by way of research and documentation. Now, what is it saying? It says in Yiddish, and here please Dora correct me if I'm not saying it wrong. Helft schreiben die Geschichte vom letzten Churban. Help write, here's the translation, the history of the latest Churban. The poster calls upon the survivors in the DP camps to bear witness and to come forward and write their history, to give testimony. And with the term Churban, the poster invoked the supreme paradigm of Jewish collective disaster, and it's a synonym of catastrophe. Churban is the destruction of the temple. So the Holocaust is another Churban, it's the latest Churban archetype of the national catastrophe. Now, what does this tell us? That the Holocaust, still not under that name, is to be understood primarily as an event in Jewish history. The Nazis, in words of David Roski's scholar of Jewish memory, a wonderful book titled "This Jewish Search for a Usable Past," David Roski says that the Nazis are seen as only the latest in the long succession of murderous outsiders who have obtruded themselves upon Jewish history. And that's what we see clearly in this poster. I.B. Singer tells it more clearly in one of his tales, one of the characters of his tales, The Family Muscat. He says, every generation had its pharaohs, its Hamans, and Hiernikis. Now it was Hitler. Both this sign, this poster, and the subsequent testimonies are expressions of Jewish collective memory. And we may say this is probably one of the first expressions of Holocaust memory, or representations of Holocaust memory. And it's important, that's what I want to underline here, this is Jewish collective memory, it's group memory. And why? Because the event is described and interpreted in Jewish terms and making sense of the event for a Jewish audience. Now let us take a big step forward. Okay, well, what we see here, maybe I can also describe, what we see is the King of Spain, the Queen, and the former Prime Minister Zapatero in 2006, the commemoration, the official Holocaust commemoration ceremony, the state ceremony that was done since 2005 in Spain. Now, obviously, the survivors of those DP camps would have never thought that the Holocaust would be remembered, commemorated, not only outside of the Jewish community, but in a country with such a loose connection as Spain. Spain is not an exception, and nowadays, last week was 27th of January, Holocaust Memorial Day, and the Holocaust was commemorated in 37 different countries, and countries as different as some of what you can see in this slide. In Norway, in Belgrade, even Istanbul, at the United Nations, in many different places, and in, as I said, more than 30 other countries. Much has happened, of course, between that poster from the DP camp and this event that I'm showing here. Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Memorial Day, on the 27th of Nisan, has become a central day within the Jewish world, but there was no move to make it an international event until the late 90s. And this happened as a result of many different initiatives, transnational, mostly top-down initiatives. In the 90s, many European countries gradually introduced days of Holocaust remembrance. These initiatives turned out to be first steps towards the establishment at the onset of the 21st century, and here we see this chronology of an international Holocaust Remembrance Day, and the date is on January 27th, the day in which the Soviet troops liberated the largest Nazi concentration camp, as you know, Auschwitz-Birkenau. January 27th was selected in order to provide a moment of collective annual remembrance across many different countries, and I quote here the Stockholm Declaration, to reaffirm humanity's common aspiration for mutual understanding and justice. Yehuda Baer, a renowned Holocaust historian, Israeli Holocaust historian, in his opening address to the International Forum on the Holocaust in Stockholm in 2000, he said the following words: "In most recent years, we have witnessed an amazing development. A catastrophe that had befallen a specific people at a specific time in a specific place has been accepted all over the world as the symbol of ultimate evil. It appears at first sight that memory of the Holocaust might be shared beyond the groups or the nations that were directly affected by it or were responsible for perpetrating. The destruction of European Jewry is remembered across borders, we have to say mostly in the Western world, but does this mean that the same story is told? The answer is no. Memories of the Holocaust exist around a dichotomy of universalism and particularism. Some see the Holocaust as the culmination of the history of anti-Semitism. Some see it as the apogee of the history of racism, and some consider it a crime against humanity. The difference between these points of view are subtle but crucial. Anti-Semitism is suffered only by Jews. Racism is a broader category and can be experienced by anyone who is different or other. Crimes against humanity are broader still and may even be considered a crime against the human condition. These differences are crucial, as I said, when it comes to draw on the lessons that the Holocaust teaches. Never again. But never again what? What are the lessons of never again? The Holocaust has become the paradigmatic never again, and the slogan can serve as a monument, a ceremony, a museum, a pledge. In all cases, it transcends time and place and constitutes a moral imperative, an ethics of avoidance. But its true meaning is disturbingly vague. The European never again, which is universal, is never again fascism. It contrasts with the Israeli and also mostly Jewish never again, which is rather particular. Never again victims. And these are not just different never agains, they might be perceived as opposed. One may urge towards non-violent action and disarmament, while the latter may advocate to be on guard, armed, or even to strike preemptively. I would like to show you this picture, and some of you might remember it. In Europe, at least, this was a big issue 10 years ago. The reactions of the Israeli Air Force planes flying over Auschwitz concentration camp in Poland. And here it showed clearly that there are fundamental differences on the lessons that the Holocaust teaches. There are four core discursive concepts involved in the debate on the universalization or particularization of the memory of the Holocaust. A, with respect to the victims of the future, as this example clearly shows. Does it concern only Jews? Is it something that can happen to others as well? B, with respect to the victims of the past. And this is a discussion about the singularity of the Holocaust, the Jewish singularity of the Holocaust, and the semantic confusion in the term Holocaust. What do we refer to when we use the term Holocaust? Is it the Jewish victims, or are we talking about all the victims of Nazism, which includes other groups as well? Gypsies, communists, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, etc. In each country, this has also different implications. In Spain, for instance, the country I come from, as you will see also from the examples that I will be showing, in Spain, this has a particular Spanish reading because there were Spanish Republicans, non-Jewish leftists who were interned in the German concentration camps, while there were no Jewish deportations from Spain. So obviously this makes a difference on how to commemorate and who to include. Another element, as regards to the perpetrators, were the Nazis unique in their evil, or was there only a quantitative difference in comparison with other forms of mass violence, such as that employed by Stalin, by Franco, by any other genocidaire, or a criminal in history? Finally, D, with respect to the carriers of public memory. Who has the right to evoke the memory of Nazism and the Holocaust? Its symbols, its metaphors, its globalized analogies. The various ways of extending and universalizing the Holocaust beyond the communities of memory affected by this historic incident not only shapes a wide, complex field of theoretical discussion, but it also forms the core of much of the discussion of the so-called neo-anti-Semitism, which is what we'll go deeper into in a minute. To identify the roots of this problem, we have to look back to history. Israel was founded as the new Europe was rising from the ruins of World War II. Both Israel and Europe took shape against the same backdrop. But the former perpetrators and the former victims drew very different conclusions from their respective memories of the Holocaust. Europe insists on humankind and universal citizenship, and Jews stand in for universal victimhood. But memory does not run the same way in Israel. It sees itself responsible for the safety of Jews. And we just have to quote the Declaration of Independence of Israel. The catastrophe which recently befell the Jewish people, the massacres of millions of Jews in Europe, was another clear demonstration of the urgency of solving the problem of its homelessness by reestablishing in Eretz Israel the Jewish state, which would open the gates of the homeland wide to every Jew. Israel does not see why it should give up the ethnic character of its state. But this apparently, and I underline apparently, irreconcilable clash between lessons drawn from the Holocaust is a source of anti-Semitism in Europe and also beyond. Particularly as the Holocaust gains such an unprecedented public significance. In this context, Israel becomes the other of an idealized new Europe. We, Europeans, are civilized and post-nationalist. They believe in the purity of the nation and act with corresponding barbarity. Chauvinism, ethnocentrism, colonialism, this would be the characteristic attributed to Israel from this perspective. As sociologist Robert Fine states, Europe has learned the universal lessons of the Holocaust. The Jews have learned only to reinstate the very malpractices the new Europe has now overcome. And again, I would like to show you a cartoon from the Spanish press, again a mainstream newspaper, ABC. And in this case, interesting, a conservative newspaper that has published this right on the day after Holocaust Memorial Day of 2006. So Israel is the incarnation of all the negative properties post-national Europe has allegedly thrown off. And Israel is represented as a racially defined state that denies human rights to those who do not belong to the nation and inclines itself towards ethnic cleansing or even genocide. And this cartoon obviously suggests that. We can clearly call this anti-Semitism, but again we need to define more specifically what is happening here. Since what we have here is an inversion of the traditional modern anti-Semitism, and therefore it is new. In the perceived post-national order, Jews are not hated for their cosmopolitanism, but much rather for their betrayal of it, for founding a state and holding on to it. The Israeli and the Jew, the Zionist Jew, that encompass most of the Jewish communities in the world, have turned into a disappointment. My colleague Bruno Shawat, who's also here and has worked much about this, said in a conference that it hasn't, it's not anti-Semitic in intent, but it's definitely anti-Semitic in its effects. Or, as his national Alain Finkel crowd has said, the best of intentions, but the worst of the effects. Against the backdrop of the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict, manifestations of Holocaust memory channel, or we may say, they channel a considerable amount of anti-Semitic hostility, and it triggers anti-Semitic resentment. I'll show you a few more images here. At the time of a moment of the Gaza intervention, 2009. So we have a Holocaust Memorial here that is written over with Israel genocide there, Israel asesino. This is in northern Spain, in Gijón.
What country is that in?
In Spain. And this is an image of Carlos Latouf, who is a, can you see that? Everybody can see it? Which is a cartoonist, very popular Brazilian cartoonist, and his cartoons are shown all over the world, mostly through the internet, also through certain news media. What is interesting here is it's at the ceremonies themselves, or in the context of Holocaust ceremonies, that these arguments are voiced. And I would like to add something, because I've been talking a lot about Europe, and there is this very particular European nature of the problem, and this is also something that Finkel has underlined. The fact, or this is at least the thesis of Finkel, the enormous difference between the US and Europe in this respect. The Holocaust reminds America of its calling. Well, that's what Finkel says, while it reminds Europe of its fragility. For America, the Holocaust is a confirmation. For Europe, it's an abyss. Post-criminal Europe is a penitent judge. It takes pride in its penitence and is always on guard against himself. So, and I would, being new to America, only a year here, I always say 2 winters here in Minnesota, rather than a year and a half. I would ask actually to the audience to have that discussion to those differences between the US and Europe. I can tell you with more confidence about what's wrong in Europe, but I'd like to know to what extent these arguments are getting more pervasive in the US. But maybe we can have the conversation afterwards. As I mentioned in the beginning, another issue that's related to this new form of anti-Semitism connected to the Holocaust is misunderstandings and wrong understandings of the nature of anti-Semitism, and basically within what might be called an anti-racist consensus. That's mainly an issue of the left. And here, these are things that we can see in different parts of the world in the political left. There has been a big discussion in the last 10 years on the issue of new anti-Semitism, to what extent the left, and particularly whether anti-racist can be anti-Semite. Isn't that a contradiction in itself? Now, research will tell us that current anti-Semitism in the left is not so much a phenomenon despite an anti-racist self-understanding, but can instead become a problem specifically because of certain theoretical perspectives on anti-racism, understandings of what anti-Semitism is and what the Holocaust is. And this, we have to say, is also affecting the scholarly community. According to historian Philip Spencer, the dominant interpretation of anti-Semitism, the dominant interpretation is the following, is that anti-Semitism is a form of racism only. It doesn't understand anti-Semitism as a specific form of ideology, an anti-modern worldview that in its structure differs very much from racism. So, in other words, the true nature of anti-Semitism is not captured if it's understood as a form of racism only. And in connection to the Holocaust, if racism is seen to be the distinguishing feature of Nazi ideology, then it is not something confined to the Jews. Many other groups have been the target of racism in the modern world. So, this will lead to the question, why the Holocaust when it is just one among many genocides? Why the Jews? Why this status of the Jews in Holocaust history and commemoration? And this takes different forms and motives, or this has different consequences that are of anti-Semitic nature. And Spencer will mention the so-called 4 R's that are sources of a new form of anti-Semitism connected to these misunderstandings. He will talk about rejection of commemoration, relativization, different forms of downplaying of the importance of the Holocaust, the significance of the Holocaust, reversal, what we see in these cartoons, the genocidal practices nowadays that are being carried out by the Jews. Of course, there are different weights of these motives. There's different degrees of anti-Semitic intensity in there, no doubt about this. And the 4th R is repetition. The fact that there are many genocides that are not being paid attention to. In the US left, for instance, the central framing is that atrocities against Native Americans and civilians in countries like Vietnam or in South America, these are not commemorated enough. The following example includes all 4, and this is from 2009 when the Muslim Council of Britain decided not to participate on the official ceremony of Holocaust Memorial Day, and it argued that commemorating the Holocaust privileged the Holocaust unfairly and for no good reason, elevating it over other genocides, past and more importantly present, particularly those in which Western imperialism bore some considerable responsibility. So here we have this post-colonial interpretation of Holocaust memory that points the critiques in that direction. I would like to conclude this section with this question that another scholar has raised, Pierre-André Taguieff, also a French scholar. The question is anti-racism being instrumentalized with an anti-Semitic agenda? What we see here is rather that anti-Semitism is a side effect of an anti-racist understanding, anti-racist position. Yeah, before coming to the conclusions, I wanted to give another element or another dimension of this new form of anti-Semitism, or another problem that leads to a new form of anti-Semitism, which is this competitive victimhood, memory envy, which is a term that Geoffrey Hartman, the literary scholar from Yale, coined, and even a term that has been used, competitive martyrology. And here, why is this connected? How is this connected to a global Holocaust memory? Probably one of the most distinctive effects of the so-called globalization of Holocaust discourses is that nations, groups, collectives claim their own narrative of suffering and victimhood. And this is measured more and more by analogy to the Holocaust. So I wanted to show this one here. This is a clear example of this. And the aspiration of those who created those different initiatives, like Yehuda Baer, the Stockholm Conference, the Task Force, the aspiration was to create a universal Holocaust memory, shared across ethnic, cultural, and national borders. This was what was envisioned with much optimism by those initiatives. But what we have now, what we see is something very differently developing, that collectives redefine representations of their own past via references to the Holocaust, in order to become visible and to gain weight in the global arena. For different reasons. And there's a legal aspect, of course, when the term genocide is used. There's a moral implication of using Holocaust imagery, Holocaust metaphors, Holocaust symbolism. So the Holocaust functions as a bridging metaphor that establishes analogic connections to other events, particularly to other traumatic histories and their memories. The consequences, any evil that befalls anyone anywhere becomes a Holocaust. The consequence, obviously, is that it deprives the Holocaust of its very significance. There is a dimension of relativization here. Of course, this is not anti-Semitic in itself, but it may have anti-Semitic side effects. Since suddenly the Jews are placed center stage, they move to the foreground. They are perceived as in competition with local memories, as Holocaust memory overshadowing or eclipsing those local memories. We have many examples of that. I won't go, I have several, there's no time to go over all of them. In Eastern Europe, for instance, equating Stalinism with Nazism, the so-called double genocide thesis. The Jews have had their day, now we have to catch up with our suffering. Stalinism, that's what they will say. But of course, comparison and equation is then also with a political agenda. And in the case of the ex-Soviet states, there is often also a clear-cut and unequivocal anti-Semitic component, which is that nationalists in the new independent states use the accusation of Jewish communism as a way to rationalize and to excuse the negative record of collaboration with Nazi Germany and their own local violence against Jewish neighbors. Thus, if Jews effectively can be made responsible for the crimes of communism, their suffering in the Holocaust can be both minimized and justified. And the complicity of Eastern European populations in mass murder can be legitimized. There was a very interesting case in the Human Rights Museum in Winnipeg, where the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress was campaigning against the plans of this museum to mount a permanent Holocaust gallery. This elected body that represents the major Ukrainian-Canadian organizations complained that the planned Holocaust exhibit was unacceptable and has asked the museum to provide the Holodomor, or the Ukrainian famine of 1932-33, no less coverage than the Holocaust. So you see that this competition and, of course, this perception, false perception, that one memory is overshadowing, is eclipsing the other, not leaving space for it, as if it was a zero-sum game, which is obviously not the case. We see in many parts of the world that victim groups and also scholars use the terminology related to Nazi crimes to characterize acts of extreme violence. We have it also in the case of Spain. Franco's troops and henchmen's actions during and after the Civil War are labeled as war of extermination, genocide, and even Holocaust. Going too fast. Here we have, for instance, this Paul Preston, the Spanish Holocaust, or some examples from posters that relate to Francoism and to Spain, but with Holocaust imagery, with Holocaust symbolism, and with Holocaust terminology. Now what we see is that this comparative victimization examples, they're unequivocally particularistic. These instrumentalizations and abuses of Holocaust memory often lead to the same accusations and anti-Semitic resentment that the universalistic approaches led to. Why should we remember the Holocaust? Memory of the Holocaust is depicted as a uniquely self-serving reference to the past. Perception of the Holocaust as a tool for other causes. Jewish influence to be blamed for the unreasonable elevation of the Holocaust over all other genocides. Arguments that are often combined with unequivocal anti-Semitic stereotypes, as understanding the Holocaust commemoration as a Jewish master plan, relating it to Jewish greed, the selfish Jew exploiting his victimhood, and that's what actually this cartoon that I wanted to show you, which is showing also this notion of the Israeli Jew exploiting his victimhood and having carte blanche to commit atrocities. So a new audience is emerging mainly in Europe, and not only, which is drawing on these arguments. The arguments are more and more mainstream, and they're part of a dangerous, I would say, clearly dangerous common sense. There are new perceptions of the Holocaust in today's world. It's important that we analyze it and that we take them seriously. Now I come to my conclusions. Holocaust memorialization is enabling anti-Semitism. How do we break out? How do we break out from this vicious circle? How can we meet the challenges posed by this constellation of troubling factors? Well, sociologists try to be good in analyzing a particular problem, but they are known not to be good in offering solutions. But let me now take out my sociologist hat and put on my hat of director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, or my general educator hat. We live in a time of a globalized public discussion, an increased presence of the Holocaust in public life, in the media, Holocaust motifs everywhere. We're all surrounded by the Holocaust. But there is still anybody who is in education, faces or engages with young people, knows that there's a notorious lack of knowledge of the Holocaust. There is not much known about the Holocaust. Teachers in our workshops, in our seminars, they will tell us that the kids say, we already know about the Holocaust. They have heard about the Holocaust. They're surrounded by the Holocaust, but they don't know about the Holocaust. And many teachers, actually, this will happen as well to many teachers. Today, I got, for instance, I think I've written it over here, I got from, for History Day, an email of a young student with a list of questions that she was asking me to respond, that her teacher had she has discussed with her teacher. One of the questions was, why did Hitler do this to the innocent Jews? What teacher will, what sort of question is that? What sort of educational initiative is it? So I was struck. This is just like came in today as an example. There must be many teachers out there that still may not have the proper knowledge to teach the Holocaust. So this is, I think I would like to underline that we have seen that most of the mentioned arguments and accusations have their grounding in a flawed understanding of the Holocaust and of the nature of anti-Semitism. And as educators, maybe we should emphasize much more that it's not so much about commemoration and more about education. Less emotion and more facts. As to this tension that I described at the beginning between these universal and particular readings, I think we have to strive towards a cosmopolitan understanding of Holocaust memory. What does it mean? The soul of cosmopolitanism is that the universal and the particular must both be preserved without either being reduced to the other. And as Jews, we are probably in an optimal position. We should be in an optimal position to do this. We have navigated for centuries in this tension between the particular and the universal. So how does this translate? We have to raise awareness of the particular among the universalists and raise awareness of the universal among the particularists and among ourselves. So we have to preserve the uniqueness, the singularity of the event without minimizing other atrocities. We have to teach the Holocaust, helping us to understand past and present human rights relations and atrocities, and strengthen our defenses against its recurrence. The Holocaust is unique, but it has universal implications. This very simple phrase by Elie Wiesel is proposing a tension that, and in this tension we must continue our efforts. And this is what I wanted to present to you. Thank you very much for your attention. The issue of racism is not necessarily connected to the notion of race. I mean, there can't be no racism, as I said before, might be institutional or not, but it's an attitude against some sort of difference, and it implies stereotypes. And there is an element in anti-Semitism that is of racistic nature. But what I try to underline is that anti-Semitism has that component. But in itself, anti-Semitism is an ideological structure that has to do with modernity, that has religious components, that has secular components. So it's, if we try to understand anti-Semitism, we have to see it in a much broader framework as an encompassing ideology that has racist elements, but that is not only anti-Semitic. Well, you have that, there's also a tension within genocide scholars and Holocaust scholars of exactly that, which is why should we pay a special attention to Holocaust scholarship when it's one among many genocides? It's true, it's one among many genocides, but obviously it has this paradigmatic character. How is the term genocide used? It is used loosely and correctly. I mean, there's a clear definition for genocide. Actually, the political dimension of it is questioned because it wasn't included in the Genocide Convention. That the groups that are defined in political terms will not be included under the Genocide Convention, but that was a success of Stalin at that point. He didn't want that, of course, in the Genocide Convention. On the Argentinian case, it's a clear, it's a disputed case in that sense. How do you define the victims of genocide? By ethnic, racial, religious, or national characters? Do we include the political or not? But sometimes there are cases of genocide that where you can apply the definition of the convention. In other cases, not. But that's this idea. There's this moralism, not only the legal dimension of it. When an event, when an atrocity becomes the definition as genocide, it's like number one of atrocities. And of course, it has an implication. And it has an implication, you mentioned the Argentinian case, if you define those events of the 70s, of the juntas as genocide, you obviously have to amplify the circle of accountability. Maybe it's not just the militaries, it's a whole context that led towards that genocide. But this brings us in another direction. That's a great question. I would say anti-Semitism exists regardless if there's memorialization or not. But the fact is that what we have here is we have a particular discourse that certain forms of memorialization and appropriation, instrumentalization, of abuse lead to anti-Semitic resentment. So Bruno made a wonderful question in my job talk. It was so wonderful I didn't even know how to respond. I don't know if it was good. He said, well, so a global Holocaust memory, is this good for the Jews? Well, I think, what I would like to emphasize is the fact that Jews have become incredibly visible through Holocaust memorialization. And that's not necessarily a good thing.
And the earliest use of the term Holocaust?
I think 1961, the Eichmann trial, I think this is, but I'm not entirely sure, Jeffrey Chandler in his book has this. I think it's 1961, the Eichmann trial, when it was transmitted through, when it was broadcasted in the US, the term Holocaust was used. And then Elie Wiesel in the 70s started to mainstream, to make it a more mainstream I mean, the issue of legitimate political criticism to Israel is what the discussion on anti-Semitism circles around this legitimacy or not of criticism. But I think this is a wrong approach to the issue, because the fact that Israel is and should be criticized. What I try to look at this from a different perspective is we have here these different motives of bringing up the issue of Jewish victimization, and that connects to automatically make an accusation. So, and this has anti-Semitic derivations. I think this is regardless of whether the critiques are legitimate or whether the actions that are whether the actions of Israel in a particular moment are legitimate or illegitimate. That's what I try to look at it from different perspectives.
Well, I mean, I've heard like Alan Dershowitz and other spokesmen say criticism of the Israeli government
is anti-Semitic.
Is anti-Semitic.
No, well, obviously this is foreclosing a discussion. I mean, that's why I think it's always when we use the term anti-Semitism, we have to grasp the true nature of the phenomenon, the structure of the phenomenon. Using the term in that way doesn't lead anywhere. And it probably does a very meager favor to any cause of defense of Israel, because it will give good arguments to anybody. No, I think that's probably a very wrong approach. Yes. Well, let me start with Spain. No, you're right. Spain is probably, I mean, it's a pioneer in racial anti-Semitism, much before there was theoretical racism in Europe in the 18th and 19th century. That's true. The laws of purity of blood, the decretos de limpieza de sangre, this is racial anti-Semitism. It's not anymore religious, because those people had converted to Christianity, and sometimes it was second or third generation, so they were tracing their ancestors in a genealogical, racial way, as was much done before. And you're totally correct that the Nuremberg laws have a clear connection to the 16th century Spain. Yes, no doubt about that. So I'm not saying that. I'm saying that there's only anti-Semitism in Germany.
Israel.
Well, definitely, it's a case of double standards, and it's all a fantasy of portraying themselves against this other, which serves a certain function of liberation.
Because Israel is not the last or the unique or the ultimate nation state, like Tony Judd would have it.
Yes, exactly. But but the issue of double standards, I would also like to add that, I mean, it's not by chance that Israel is selected.
Sure.
Because it's so. I'm not entirely. I don't agree when. Of course, there's double standards, but the connection between Europe and Israel is what it is, and that's the reason why. And I have to add also, it's interesting. I mean, in France, you have now the incredible problem of enormous significance. The fact it's also not by chance that there are so many great scholars that are trying to elucidate and to define and to explain what is going on. And, I think Finkel, Tagiev, and several others are probably really leading us. What are our defenses against neo-antisemitism? In Spanish we say this is la pregunta del millón, the question of the million, $1 million question. But I have underlined, and maybe that's something that needs to be discussed, whether commemoration is a way to deal with this. Since commemoration has this incredibly ambivalent functions, and you even see, and I've been part of in Spain of the delegation of the task force, and see how it has been done in Spain and in other countries, and sometimes you see that, for instance, Jewish communities will participate as one of the organizations in those commemorative events that are planned in a way that the outcome is completely different. I just watched the other day on the ceremony that took place in the Spanish Senate the other day. One of the representatives of the Gypsy community said that the Jews are rich people in the commemoration. So this is so anti-Semitism gets into the commemoration itself. It's absurd. So I would say, what can we? I think we have to let's try to frame differently the issue of commemoration. Let's take a step back, and I would say less commemoration and much more education and more facts, less emotion, less candlelighting, and more reading history. That's what I would say. I wouldn't say essential. It is embedded in Western culture. Yes, that's a short answer. But and the longer answer, let's look at Jewish emancipation, and the modern concept of anti-Semitism is connected to Jewish emancipation, 18th century, Baer, combining religious elements that are of millenary, of millennia, with modern racial concept. I would say it's a part of it, but it is not necessarily something that has always to be attached to Western culture, or has to be something that we can fight against. It's not something that is inherent. I'm not sure.
Okay.
Lost my right now.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for the talk. I want to reinforce that. You said earlier that the Jews are becoming incredibly visible. So.
Yes. Of course, the issue of visibility needs further explanation. Of course, and it has a lot to do with Europe. I mean, if we're talking about visibility of Jews, it's also related to the fact that the tragedy of the Jews becomes visible. And this automatically leads to a sort of resentment and of comparison towards the tragedies, the local tragedies. You can't blame anybody. You can't blame the Latvians for for wanting to commemorate their suffering and understanding this. It was something that happened 20 years ago, not 70 years ago. But the fact is that and that's why often Holocaust commemoration is a flawed enterprise, because it might be done in a way that can lead towards that type of resentment. So when I'm talking about that type of visibility, it's the visibility of the Jewish tragedy that is omnipresent, that is everywhere. And that leads to anti-Jewish resentment. Yeah, I would need more.